The first time you have the conversation, you are in the mode of progressing the conversation. But re-listening to the conversation is when you actually hear the real meat of what's going on. Like, you're picking up enough from the conversation to get to the next question and to, like, kind of build on what they've already told you. But you're not able to see the real story until it's over. Like, I truly believe that. And having somebody else take notes for you, I've just never had any luck with that. I need that separate time to listen to it again to get it to be something that I remember.
Welcome to the Conversation Factory. I'm your host, Daniel Stillman. I'm investigating how we create change through changing conversations. Each episode, I'll talk to an amazing conversation designer to try to distill insights we can all bring into our work and lives. You can be part of the conversation in two ways. The first, head over to theconversationfactory.com and subscribe to the newsletter to never miss an episode. That's theconversationfactory.com. The other way is to be part of the show. If there's a challenging transformation you want some help with, head over to theconversationfactory.com/coaching to fill out a survey to get 30 minutes of free coaching that I might use on the show. Be a part of the show and get 30 minutes of coaching at theconversationfactory.com/coaching. This episode was fun. I love Abby Covert. She's a delight to talk with. It was interesting editing this episode because I could see it was more of a conversation than an interview, as opposed to episode 1 with Phil McKenzie, just from the waveforms. Abby is an information architecture rock star, and you'll learn more about her in a minute. We talk about how much my mother loves her book, How to Make Sense of Any Mess, how to really plan research to reduce bias, and how to hold the space for problem framing versus problem solving. Abby Covert!
Daniel Stillman!
Thank you so much for doing this, not once, but twice. The first time, it turns out you should have batteries in your digital audio recorders so that in case you get up in the middle to go to the bathroom, that when you come back, when you trip on the wire, you don't unplug the digital audio recorder, not allowing it to close the file, and then it gets corrupted and lost completely.
Yes. I'm glad that I was a part of you learning, like, podcasting 101. Don't lose the recording.
Step 1, don't waste the time of the person you're interviewing.
It was not a waste of time.
Step
It was a
2,
wonderful conversation, but
which you and I only know.
I know. Isn't that, it's kind of beautiful.
Well, so that's actually something I want to talk about. But first, I would like to, so I know you. I've known you for a while. I consider you a friend. And you are a preeminent information architect, a global thought leader of information architecture. You wrote what, as far as I know, is the first general interest information architecture book, a book that made my mother want to become an information architect.
Shut up. Did that really happen?
Yeah. My mom read your book.
Oh.
I can't really pronounce it in Espanol. It's Cómo darle sentido a cualquier caos, or how to make sense of any mess. You travel the world talking about information architecture for money. You help companies with their information architecture, and lately you've decided to give all of your information architecture loving to one company, Etsy, where you were the staff information architect, where I demeaned your job by likening it to like a person who repairs large presses at a newspaper. So that's my introduction for you. Welcome, Abby Covert.
It was brilliant. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Things I want to talk to you about today. A year ago, when we had our first conversation about conversation design, you talked about something that still I really love and think about a lot, which is if you're designing a conversation, you're in a position of manipulation. And there's a lot of responsibility that goes along with that.
Yes.
And so, not IA aside, but you are facilitating conversations about information architecture all the time. And because you're designing with people and not for them, how do you navigate your own bias?
Well, how do I navigate my own bias? I mean, I guess admitting that I have one is the first step. trying to avoid admitting that you have one is probably the worst way to go about acknowledging it and moving on.
So self-awareness.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is self-awareness. I think some of it is understanding the intention of the conversation over the intention of yourself, if that makes any sense. Like the intention that you have for the conversation and looking at that separately from the intention that you just have for how you want to get through a normal conversation with a normal human.
So it's like you acknowledge that it's a special type of conversation and you put yourself
separate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to. I mean, I think that it's really easy to get mixed up in terms of having a conversation with somebody where the intention is to seem really smart or to prove your value to the organization that you're working with. And that can kind of get in the way of actually getting at the things that you want to talk to them about. Like a really good example of that is I play dumb a lot in conversations with people at the beginning of projects. So I'll know something about what we're talking about, but I might pretend that I don't at all. They might say like, oh, have you heard of this side project or outcome that we worked on in the last 6 months? And I'll say like, oh, no, nobody's told me about that yet. Why don't you go ahead and tell me? Because there's a part of you that could jump into that conversation and tell them what you know about it as opposed to listening to what they have to tell you about it.
Yes.
And I value listening to it from their perspective. So, in terms of your question about bias, it's sort of like my bias might be to seem really well informed and lead the conversation so that I come out seeming like an expert. But the intention of the conversation is for me to understand that person's unique perspective on the thing that I'm trying to learn about. So I have to set aside my bias and look a little dumb sometimes as a result. But yeah,
it's funny
I prefer to do that.
I think there's this fear of looking dumb that I think most of us have in our professional lives that is totally justified, right? We're generally paid to be smart. Mm-hmm. And so there is a bit of like a tension there.
Yes.
But on the flip side, I found that the more you allow other people to participate, it actually winds up making you maybe not looking smart, but everyone's happy.
Well, yeah, the best way to actually look smart is to make the people around you look smart.
Yeah. Because
all of a sudden they think that you're, I mean, I have had meetings where I have not said anything that wasn't in the form of a question, and somehow I come out looking like I know my shit. When I didn't say anything that added anything to the conversation other than like prodding them to go deeper or to explore a topic. And somehow it turns into this situation where they think that I am smart about the subject.
I think that's wonderful. For me,
back to the manipulation.
Well, yeah, but see, that's
that got us started.
Like, that is manipulative.
Yeah, it is manipulative. It's manipulative to pretend that you don't know about something just because you want to hear how they describe it. That's manipulative, but it's also a tactic.
Yeah,
that works.
And therefore, I justify it because the ends.
Well, I think that manipulation gets a bad rap. Manipulation's not a negative. It's not a negative word in terms of its denotation, right? It is negative in its connotation. We've adopted the idea that manipulation is negative.
Oh, right, because we manipulate paper, cloth,
and clay and food.
Soap. I manipulated the soap as I washed
my body. Exactly. Like, manipulation is not right.
To use the soap.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a negative term, but it takes on a negative tone, especially when you apply it to your interaction with other people.
Yes. So this brings up the other thing that I think about with these sorts of conversations, which is power. Mm-hmm. Because you've been invited in and given this position in a way. Like you have a special place. They expect this of you in a way. Like they know, oh, Abby's from the outside. We know that we're going to have to explain this to her so that she can help us make sense of this mess.
Yes.
There is this supposition. Yeah. And I wonder if you have any advice for those of us who are in situations where we are not being given that invitation.
So I actually, this is, for whatever reason, this reminds me of a question that I got from a student recently. She asked me, what do you do when you know your user really well? And I thought that was like a really I don't know, remarkable question. It was a question that I don't get asked very often. And I had to ask her, like, what do you mean you know them very well? And she said, well, I'm friends with and related to so many people that are in my user group that I want to know, like, how do I conduct research with them without that getting in the way, me knowing them too much? And the advice that I gave to her, I think actually applies to this situation, which is I told her to dedicate time at the beginning of the conversation to explaining why she's not going to be like herself for the purpose of the conversation. Like, sort of, hey, we're going to be talking about this thing that I'm working on. And because of that, I have to set aside my like personal relationship with you. And I need to like conduct this in a very scripted manner in a certain way so that I get the right information out of you. And I feel like for people who are maybe, you know, not given that position of coming in from the outside and having the excuse not to know the things that they're trying to get other people to tell them. Yeah, I would have a similar mindset of like, you need to probably tell the people that you're going to converse with, like, hey, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm trying to figure something out from this beginner's mindset. So don't consider it patronizing if I ask you what an acronym means, even though you think I already know, or if I press you to define something more simply because I'm trying to get like a set of vocabulary out of you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And you know, I often think about that as like suspending disbelief, where you're like, look, frogs don't talk and stuffed animals are not alive. But if you are not willing to believe this, you can't enjoy the Velveteen Rabbit or Frog and Toad or Friends.
And that would be sad.
And that would be really sad.
So for the purpose of this meeting, let's pretend I don't work here.
Yeah, and that's often sometimes right. So let's just pretend I don't work here. I like working here.
Well, like some of the questions that I've used in the past with clients and with colleagues is questions like, how would you describe that to a grade school classroom, right? Like, how would you describe that to your elderly parents? Like, how would you describe that complicated technological thing that you just spurt out of your mouth like it's, you know, second language to you? Like, how would you explain that to someone who doesn't know how to use a smartphone?
Yes.
You know, doesn't know what the internet is.
Yes.
And kind of like working on that. So sometimes maybe it's not just about the setup, but about the actual questions that you ask.
Yeah.
I also tend to use a script. I'm very scripted when it comes to conversation design. I don't necessarily stick to the order of the script. I let that be a little bit more of as we go, kind of let's see how things weave together. But I use the excuse of the script up front to excuse myself for asking really simple questions. Like I'll say something like, so I'm going around the organization this week and I'm talking to all of these people about X. And so today I'm going to ask you your opinion on those things. And I'm asking everybody the same set of questions, right? This is the way that I can ask a CEO what their job is, right? Because I asked everybody else what your job is. And like, do I know what the CEO's job is going into the interview? Absolutely. I do. I have some concept of it. But listening to them describe their job for me in the words that they choose and the hierarchy that they give that explanation means something.
Yeah.
So I use the script as the excuse of how I can ask questions that are maybe inappropriate of asking certain people. I love
it. So you sort of put something else. You give if you don't have the power, somehow you give it to some.
I have a clipboard that I use
that
on purpose.
I think
the power of the clipboard.
I think they've done studies on this. Vice has, at least, or like with a yellow like hazmat suit and a clipboard, you can go pretty much anywhere.
Anything. You can ask anybody anything. Right. Yeah. Once again, manipulation.
Yeah. But in the service of good.
Yeah.
It's funny. So I brought the flip side to the index card about manipulation was.
It's literally the flip side.
Literally the flip side.
He literally flipped it over.
And this is a direct quote from Abby Covert to herself. And I think similarly, the way that you would be trained in talking to users, I think you would need to remember the role of bias and how framing can bias conversations. Mm-hmm. And so we talked about this a long time ago about how you use the same script because there's magic in asking the same bunch of people the same question. And you try to frame things both from the positive frame and the negative frame.
Yes.
Right. So even if they give a positive response, you challenge them to give a negative response. And I'm wondering why you do that instead of just asking for, like, unframe the question.
Why do I do that instead of unframe the question? So, I mean, example of this would be when I ask somebody about the weaknesses of something before I ask about the strengths of it. Right? Like
Sure.
there's magic in asking for the weaknesses of something.
Yes.
And there's even more magic in asking it before you've allowed them to say what's good about it. Right? There's other times where it makes sense to ask about opportunities before you ask about improvements. Right? Like those are basically asking the same question, but there's a slightly different connotation to the word opportunity than there is improvement. One is slightly more positive than the other is negative. So there's magic in asking those things in that kind of combination, like in the opposite order. So,
and that
I don't know.
Is that the magic is that people will somehow, I call it like rotating the problem. They're like, well, I'm looking at it from this side, and you're like, oh, well, can you actually tell me what's on the back
what's on
side?
the other side? Yeah.
And they're like, oh, yeah, I never looked at the other side. Yeah, I guess there's some stuff there too.
I mean, usually I don't find that I've never looked at the other side. It's more like, oh, you're going to make me do that? Like you're going to make me tell you that stuff that I don't want to talk about? Because there's certain people who don't want to talk about what's wrong. And then there's other people who really want to talk about what's wrong.
Yes.
Right? So there's value in asking the person who doesn't want to talk about what's wrong to talk about what's wrong. And then there is extreme value in talking to the person who thinks everything is wrong and wants to talk nothing about anything else to say, like, but what's not wrong? Like, what's good about what's going on? It's kind of putting people outside of their comfort zone.
Yes. And, in terms of like the cultural absorption of whatever you're trying to shift, like, I can imagine that getting the people who are on all the different sides of the spectrum to start thinking about the other sides of the spectrum must be of some help.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you have to make sure that the bias is not in the recruit, right? And that happens with users too, but it happens within organizations when you're interviewing people that you're working with.
When you say bias in the recruit, like making sure that you're asking a diverse group of, making sure you're not just talking to the haters.
Right.
And not just talking to the lovers.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you were to, let's say that you were trying to figure out how people felt about the thing that you were working on, and you recruited only like power users off of a marketing database where they had checked very satisfied on the satisfaction survey.
Yes.
Like that would be biasing your recruit, and everything that you would hear from that group would be reflecting that bias.
Yes.
Similarly, if I go into an organization and they only want me to talk to people in the marketing group, or they only want me to talk to people in the engineering team, that is introducing a level of bias that isn't productive. So I try to break through those boundaries and look for other people. I generally ask to see an org chart so I can turn it into a checklist.
Make sure that you're covering all of the people. And we talked about this a little last time. This is from the, I think this is from the workshop that you're still going to do. You haven't done that workshop yet for the IA Summit.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Collaborative information architecture.
Collaborative information architecture. Designing for humans that we design with. Mm-hmm. The coworkers, clients, and stakeholders are all users of our work, and we should be learning to design for them as much as we design for our end users. But it sounds like you're also talking about designing with all of those people. Yes,
but I think the designing for them, especially when you look at information architecture, I don't make things that end users use in the sense of an organization's end users. I make things that the people in the organization use, right?
Yeah.
So my users are the people in the organization, but their users are often the end users. And in order to do my job, I need to understand who their users are, and I need to work with them to get to that understanding and to make sure that that comes through the work. But I'm designing for the people within the organization. And that is something that I don't feel enough people that are in that position think about. Like, we don't apply the same user-centered research techniques to our coworkers and our clients that we do to our users. And I think there's a real opportunity there.
Hugely. In my own experience, it's because of time.
Well, time.
Right? Because your water bottle's right over there, by
you.
the way. For those of you, this is radio, and I know I can see where your water bottle is, even though you can't.
I couldn't see it, but here it is.
So, to have a meeting that is undesigned is very costly.
Yes.
But I don't know which cognitive bias this is, but to spend 2 hours to design an hour seems wasteful. But it's not, because the amount of time that all of the people combined cost in that room for that hour is gastronomous, right? Whereas your time in those 2 hours are presumably less costly because there's just one of you, right? Or even doing a brain trust where you spend an hour and you show 2 people and talk about your intention for this other 2 hours, and then doing some more thinking for this 2 hours. Like, we're burning like 4 or 5 hours for a 2-hour meeting, which to some people seems outrageous, but for you does not seem outrageous.
No, I mean, I feel like I'm not magic. Like, I can't walk into a room and immediately ascertain the intention that I am supposed to get out of the conversation and then get it out of them in an artful way that doesn't leave them feeling like they have whiplash. Like, there has to be some crafting of the narrative to figure out, like, what do I need to get out of this conversation? Who is this person? What organization am I in? Like, all of those things, they need time to think about them. I mean, I don't know. I have been in meetings where people have interviewed me, where there's like absolutely no thought to it. Like, okay, let's take this podcast, for example. Like, we're sitting here and Daniel has a table full of note cards with quotes and questions and things that he wants to ask me about, right? That's not wasting my time as the participant here, the one being interviewed. And I feel similarly about the folks that I'm asked to interview or work with in organizations. It's like, you don't want to waste their time while you flail with no idea what you're trying to get out of it. So,
yeah. Well, this is the other quote, which I have written down from the workshop invitation, which was, I want them to understand how much more efficient and rewarding it is to share the work with others.
Yeah, and that's specifically speaking to, like, in the information architecture space, and I think a lot in the design space, there's a feeling of, let me go into my bat cave and do some stuff, and then I will come out with the big ta-da, and I will show it to people, and then people will give me feedback on it, and I will iterate. And in my experience, what actually happens is you go into your bat cave, you do that thing, you come out with the ta-da, and everybody goes, well, why didn't you think about this? Well, why didn't you ask me about that? Well, what about this? Well, what about that? And the next thing you know, it's like death by 1,000 cuts on the thing that you're trying to get iteration on. And it's not iteration. You're doing the collaboration part at the wrong time. You're like creating this straw dog just to burn it. And I don't understand that.
You used the straw thing a lot last week. Is it a straw man? Is it a straw dog? What is a straw dog?
It depends. I mean, like, burning a straw man is strong as imagery. So I went with straw dog. Because somehow burning a straw dog is less intense. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the metaphor.
Burning a straw dog.
Just burning a straw something. Insert sentient.
So it is actually one of the argument fallacies. Like, I forget, there's like 12 of them or something. Like, the ad hominem is a logical fallacy, like to attack the person instead of the argument.
Yeah.
And the straw man, I'm sure there's a Latin phrase for it.
Stralimus.
Exactly.
Manimus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rob and I found there was like a ninth one that we were all very excited to figure out. But yeah, sorry, that's a rabbit hole right there.
Rabbit hole, straw dog.
Straw dog.
Metaphors everywhere.
looping back around. So, because some
Let's
people
just do the rest of the podcast in nothing but metaphors.
all metaphors.
All metaphors all the time.
It's like, I don't have any other ones. I'm sure we'll think of some others. So the straw man, the straw thing.
The straw person.
Like, are you just saying that more hands should be touching the building of the straw thing?
I don't think it's about hands. I think it's about brains.
Right. I meant
So
brains and hands.
But I feel like, no, because I feel like those are different. Like, I'm not advocating to sit in a room and like move things around to their final resting place with a group of people. But I am advocating for having collaborative exercises that allow you to experiment with those movements with a group of people so that you are more educated on where to move that thing later on.
Sure.
Like the general, the efficiency and time like gained part to me is that when you come out of a collaboration with a thing that you worked on with other people, those other people are not likely to turn around and be like, that's not at all what I wanted. Like,
right.
They have ownership of it. They've already voiced all their concerns when things were at a really low fidelity versus you spending a whole lot of time making a thing and then asking for feedback, putting them on the defense and saying like, I wasn't involved in this. You didn't ask me for this. You didn't take into account these things that I know as my expertise. And then, you get into that cycle of revisions.
So what's the right way to bring more brains into the process sooner?
I think that the right way, at least in the cadence of my work, tends to be interviewing people separately. So separating them from the herd and getting their unique perspectives on things. Organizing a moment for them to come back together so that I can tell them what I heard and I can point out the places that I think there is conflict. And also, at the same time, I really like to focus on pointing at the things that we all agree on. Because that's something that, especially in a very like tenuous situation where people are kind of like on edge with each other in an organization, they can make the assumption that they don't agree on anything. And so taking the moment to kind of be like, look, I talked to all of you individually. You all spent the time with me to know like the things that we're going to talk about today. And you know your individual parts of it. But I want to start with, we agree on more than you might assume. And here are the things that we agree on. And then going into these are the places that conflict. And then from there, we can have productive conversations. I often end up using visualization exercises in those productive conversations of like, two people are arguing about what something is. I'll make one of them draw it for the whole group so that we can have a more productive discussion about it at like an object level. And then from there, I usually leave with a feeling like I can make a thing that's way more informed than the thing I would have made at the beginning to use as my straw dog man.
Straw dog man. So there's like my head is buzzing with like, I think at least three things that I'd like to sort of tease apart. And one is the process of getting a group of people not just to input on the solution of the problem, but also to define the edges of the problem. Right? Because I imagine that these problems can often be very mushy, and they can go all the way to the edge, like the Carl Sagan apple. Like we're like, it's all the things ever, forever.
Universe.
It's the universe.
Yeah.
And the other is about just making sure, I want to make sure we talk about drawing with people in a professional setting, because it's something I believe a lot in. It's something I enjoy tremendously, is getting people to physicalize and visualize for themselves. And I think some people are like, people can't do that. They resist that. And I'm like, I found that they like to do it.
Yeah.
So those are some things that I would like you to eminence or preeminence upon.
Gosh. Eminence. So one thing that I have found is often when we get to the point of like, here are the things that are wrong, or the opportunities. Here are the opportunities / improvements that we could make. I like to do an exercise around assessing the impact versus the complexity and I use a quadrant diagram to map them so that we can see how they relate to one another. And that gets into the diagram of like the universe versus the apple.
So
like,
impact versus complexity, like, because
like
in Luma,
how much
we do
will
like,
this matter and how much will we have to work to have this matter?
So it's interesting because often I've seen that's like as an importance versus difficulty, or a cost versus difficulty. I've even seen, I sometimes like to use importance versus enthusiasm.
That's an interesting one.
Because like, I'm like, I don't care how much it costs. If it's important and you guys want to do it, let's do it. But I've never heard complexity and impact.
Yeah.
Because there, obviously, you should do things with high impact and low complexity.
Not
necessarily.
Not necessarily. And that's why I like the exercise, because it doesn't actually have judgment. Like it's not saying, oh, everything that ends up in quadrant 1 is going to be what we do first. It's just admitting how the things relate to one another.
So I would love it. This is really, because I'm a framework junkie. I have my way of unpacking the importance difficulty matrix. I would be very curious what your wrap is to sort of get people to like think about quadrant 1 versus quadrant 4, whichever those two are.
Well, I mean,
and maybe we should take this into the chalkboard potentially.
There's a chalkboard in the bathroom of this hotel room, and I don't think that we're going to go in there. But no, I think we can just, draw pictures with our hands for this. Since we're on the radio, we probably shouldn't get into any advanced visualization. No. We should make ourselves describe things with words out of our mouth.
I think
but
supposed to add rebut.
Right. It's all the bathroom humor.
Talking out of your ass. I didn't invent that phrase.
True.
You said we're only talking in metaphors.
Only talking metaphors and bumper stickers for the rest of the podcast.
My other truck is a truck. It's the only bumper sticker I could think of.
A good one. So complexity and impact.
So, by the way, which one do you use as the y-axis, and which do you think it matters, or do you draw one the other way usually?
I'm trying to think if I have like a consistent order for them. I don't think it matters.
And when you say complexity, because people ask me this question, do you mean...
What do you mean?
Organizational complexity?
Right.
Or do you mean like technical complexity?
Well, it depends on the exercise.
Human complexity.
Like it depends on my audience and it depends on the exercise. So you asked like, how do I set that up? One of the biggest things is you have to define complexity and you have to define impact.
What do you mean when you say mean?
Right. What do you mean when you say mean? What do you mean when you say define? So... for a typical...
By the way, this is like what an information architect
does.
Is just you.
Define terms.
Yeah.
Yes. What do you mean when you say mean? So defining what complexity means in the actual context of the exercise and whatever we're trying to work out. I mean, I've done this on projects that are really high-level strategic endeavors, but I've also done this on projects that are lower-level executional details, right? And complexity means something much, much different in both of those circumstances. Yes. So does impact. Yeah. I try to explain upfront and also have the words written out and referenceable throughout the exercise what those two things mean, and to be very specific about it. Like, does impact mean impact to a user's experience, or does it mean organizational efficiency, right? Does it mean both?
Yes.
Could it mean both? So that's one thing. And then also, as you plot points on that quadrant, you're also having conversations that are recording what is the impact and what is the complexity of these things. So it's not just the diagram of those things compared to one another. It's also the spreadsheet list of, here's the things that are on the quadrants. And then when we say impact, this is what we mean for this particular thing. Here are the impacts. Here are the complexities.
Now, are you doing this on an Excel sheet, or are you doing this on a wall with 15 people? Like, what's the context you tend to do this in?
I generally do it on a whiteboard because I find that's the easiest way to plot points and remove them quickly, because people will be like, no, it's not that impactful as that thing. So you have to be able to kind of move things around very quickly. So I don't find Post-its are helpful with quadrant mapping.
Really?
No, because they're too big.
You have too many things how many things are you plotting in this thing?
I would say probably max would be 25 or 30. Minimum would be probably like 4 to 6. something like that.
It's very interesting because in the context of the design thinking workshops that I do, the importance difficulty matrix in the Luma system, I tend to have a group of 4 people, or 4 or 5 in a group of 20 who have about like 8 ideas, because Luma asks you to do a forced ranking. And so 8 is the number of Post-it notes that can fit along the bottom edge.
Oh, yeah.
Of a thing.
There
So we
you
do there's a forced ranking,
right?
which I really enjoy. And then, but I've also done it with 20 people. All 20 people bring, 5 ideas from their ideation process, and then you've got 20 things on there.
Yeah, it's I don't know, for whatever reason I've not had a lot of luck with quadrants and Post-its.
No,
I think because they're square. They don't like the point.
Yeah.
The point matters, and like if with a Post-it, where is the point? Is the point at the center of the Post-it, or is the point at the top left-hand corner of the Post-it? Like the point matters.
Yeah, it sure does.
So anyway, so I have that.
You could just
and
make
then,
a dot at the upper right-hand corner and say this is the point. But I gotcha.
Yeah. And then I generally have someone who is taking notes into a spreadsheet around the impact and complexity. Yeah.
Around the discussion that's happening.
Yeah.
And are you the hand or are you...
I am the hand.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because I describe it as the moment in The Princess Bride, which a movie... Well, right. So when he calls upon the spirit of his dead father to guide his sword...
Oh, God, yeah.
So that he can find the knot.
Yes.
To get into the pit of despair to find the man in black.
That's basically when I'm the hands. That's what it's like.
Right. So I tell people you allow the spirit to guide your hand.
Right.
And people are like, no,
lower, higher,
yes.
no, left, right, wait,
there.
Yeah, and then if you put the point down too soon, it was like, no, not yet. And then it's always like, 3 items later on that they're like, well, actually, now compared to that one, this one needs to move.
Right. So this is the interesting thing about
because it's all comparison. Like there is no, you don't have any metrics by which to discern the height or the depth of each of the spectrum.
Yes.
So it's always going to be a comparison between the things.
Right. And this is why I think there is some value, at least in the way that I was taught the importance difficulty matrix with Luma, is the first one basically goes in the middle because we don't know. And then everything else.
Oh, interesting.
Everything getting moved around, and you only do one axis at a time. Whereas you are doing both at a time, which I've also done. When you have a large group of people, it kind of just tends to go that way. But I try to do forced ranking of one axis and then allow the next axis, where we just take all 25 things and we say, how complex are these things?
Right. Order them.
Yeah. And usually we do the importance. I would do the importance first because that's something, because then let's just talk about the value before we talk about how hard it is.
Right. That makes sense.
But it's a very rich. So
I would like to try it that way.
Yeah. There's I think it's a very, the forced ranking is interesting. And then doing one at a time is interesting too. What do the different quadrants signify to you? Like, do you give them names? Are there bands of? No,
there's not.
So in a way, the quadrants there are no quadrants are irrelevant. There's no
the quadrants
do this first, do that first.
No, because I generally think that the visualization that comes out of it is helpful for people to understand the list of things. Like if you give people a spreadsheet with 30 things in it, with like little blocks of text about the complexity and impact of each of those things, it's just going to be a wash. Like they're just going to like get overwhelmed before they even get into it.
Yes.
Versus if you give them a visualization of this is how those things compare to one another.
Yes.
Their mind is going to gravitate to a place in those quadrants, but I don't prejudge which ones they should focus on. Like it's not like, oh, this one's number 1, this one's number 2. It's more like, oh, this person is looking for something that is of high impact and low complexity because they're planning stuff that can get done in the next 3 months. So they're going to go down there. This executive person is looking for what's the highest impact thing that they're going to have to invest a lot of money in, hence is complex. So therefore,
because they want to make
they
vice president.
Yeah, exactly. They need to think like, on the 3 years out kind of time scale.
Can you give me an example, non-confidentially, obviously, of like what would be on these not Post-it notes? Like, what are the names of these things? Like, what are they?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like, clarify onboarding flow, strengthen search engine. Like, I mean, they're tactical things that have come out of the conversations that have been had around ways that we need to improve, or they're opportunities, depending on what kind of person you are. They're opportunities for change.
Of the whatever users, whatever experience.
Whatever we're working on.
Yeah.
I mean, are we working on an entire ecosystem of an organization, or are we working on one process that's being modified for efficiency? Like, the list is going to be very different depending on what the context is.
Yeah.
Still the same exercise.
Yeah. It's very interesting because with the importance difficulty matrix, people tend to have there's names like low-hanging fruit and quick wins and stuff like that. And I agree with your analysis 100% that there's this supposition that one quadrant is better than the other.
Right.
I think the only quadrant that we can all agree is kind of not great is the low importance, high complexity quadrant. Maybe
low impact.
Yeah, low impact, high complexity.
I don't know, man.
Tell me about that. That is great, because usually I'm like, fuck that quadrant. Hey, this is Daniel. We're about at the halfway point, so this is a great time. You might want to get up, stretch your legs, and get some popcorn. Fill up your soda. Also, head over to theconversationfactory.com and sign up for the newsletter. Stay in touch. I'm always trying to extract some best practices from these interviews and make some great tools, turn them into PDFs to share with you. And those are things I send to my subscribers. So make sure you head on over to theconversationfactory.com, sign up for the newsletter, and stay in touch.
Well, there's things that end up in that quadrant that are like on the, what I would call like the good housekeeping list. You know, like there's things that might end up on that list that you couldn't attach the complexity, or you couldn't attach the like importance of, for whatever reason, he just unplugged the refrigerator in this hotel room, and that was really strange.
Buzzing.
It threw me off.
I'm sorry, but it's really buzzing.
But is it buzzing loud enough for these microphones?
I won't know until I get this into post because I don't have my headphones in.
So anyways, the things that are low impact but high complexity.
By the way, it's just soda in there. It's totally going to be fine.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's totally fine. No, there's like spoiling milk now in this hotel fridge.
Never getting invited back to the new hotel.
Never getting back to the new hotel. So no, there's things that I think happen in the low impact zone that, depending on how you define impact, can keep you from doing things that might still be a good idea to do, but you're not doing because it's complex. So for example, let's say that you've defined impact as impacting the bottom line, right? But one of the things that you've identified will have very little impact on the bottom line, is very complex to fix, but it's also something that we think is maybe tangentially related to user satisfaction or lifetime value of a user or some other metric by which we could have measured things.
Yes.
So I don't use it as an elimination exercise.
Yes.
We're not trying to eliminate things from the list. We are just comparing all the things on the list to each other. That also means that the things that we're using that quadrant for are things that we've all agreed need to be prioritized and dealt with.
I see. So
it's not like
yes.
Oh, here's 50 things, let's get it down to 10.
Yes.
It's here's 50 things. We need to put some level of order on these 50 things so that we can understand the relationships they have to one another.
That is a very different point in the conversation to use. I've generally used it as a filtering.
Like idea generation.
Well, and actually as a, two ways. One, as a way of down selecting the number of things so that we're focusing on whatever quadrant they think they want to focus on. But the second, which is a way that I think you're using it, that I use it as well, or at least my version of it, is that something can be moved from one area to another based on how you interpret it.
Right, how you define what the things mean.
And saying like, this thing, which is ultra complex and ultra impactful, must be done somehow. And so is there a way to do it a little bit now that's less complex?
Right.
right? Then that's
break it into its pieces.
Right. Can you say yes, can we decomplexify this since it's so important?
Right.
We're so impactful. Can we find a way to prototype?
Mm-hmm.
Or, I'm using prototype cautiously now because our friend Carl critiqued me for using the word prototype because I think he finds it distasteful at this moment in his life. But
Carl, why do you find it distasteful?
Well, because I was using it in the context of telling my mother that she needed to prototype traveling to see if she and my father could actually. I did a design. I did a design thinking exercise with my parents and my brother, where we were talking about we did some scenario planning.
That's so adorable.
We had 5 boards with 5 different scenarios, and we did rose, thorn, bud on each scenario, and there were various hypotheses that we teased out. So this is a thing. This is something that I think is worth just pressing on him for one more moment, which is that you are providing a space for people to hold a question and not necessarily go straight to the answer.
Right.
And there's something really special about that.
I mean, that's what I like about that particular exercise is that we're not solving problems in meetings like that. We're organizing problems. We're just putting structure on problems so that we can think about them in relation to one another. There's it's a very low pressure environment, which I think relieves a lot of anxiety.
Yes. I think that is, I would maybe call it pre-solving them, because it's still you are organizing the
pre-solving.
Pre-solving them.
That's so buzzy.
Is it?
It's preeminent.
Well, I think of it as pre-solving them. I mean, you call it organizing the information so that it can be later solved.
Yeah.
I call it, it's like mise en place for cooking.
It is like mise en place. It's mise en place for information.
So last night we were making biscuits, and we had to manufacture buttermilk first.
We did.
And then we had to manufacture leavening.
Then there was no leavening.
Yeah, and so I measured out the flour for both the savory and the savory and the sweet biscuits. Mm-hmm. And that's just preparing everything
right
before you go into it. And so it sounds like similarly in your facilitation work, you are saying we're just going to set everything up.
Yeah. I'm basically the sous chef.
Yes.
I am definitely not the chef.
But the question you're asking people, which is very interesting, you are providing this low stakes environment for them by saying we're not going to solve the problem. We're just going to look at and organize the problem.
Right.
Even though that is part of solving the problem.
Yeah. Because there's things that happened in the digging into each of those things, especially when you start to ask people to identify the impact and more so the complexity, where you start to unravel the things that are keeping those problems from being solved otherwise.
Yes.
Right? So why is this complex? Well, it's complex because the technology that we need to do it is very expensive. Is a much different complexity than it's complex because these 5 groups have never worked together before and now they're going to have to. Right.
So you're working in situations where there's time and resources being given to this type of thinking. Mm-hmm. What do you say to people who are in more strapped environments where there is this pressure? You're there because there's resources for people to say, they're willing to feel less efficient for a little while, knowing that it will be more efficient and that Abby's going to make it so much better by doing it her way. Mm-hmm. But in a lot of places, there's no Abby and they can't afford an Abby.
Right.
I'm thinking of lots of people in my experience who work in small to medium businesses where they are working on complex and important things and don't feel like they have the time to facilitate these kinds of discussions. What do you say to these people?
The first thing is, I would say to start small. I believe in quick wins. Specifically quick wins around facilitation. So a good example of that would be somebody could be listening to this conversation and thinking oh, great. Now I have to get a bunch of people from my company and I have to talk to all of them individually. And then I have to get them in a room and I have to set aside a couple hours and we have to go through this list of 15 things and we have to make quadrants and then we have to make a spreadsheet and then we have to go through the spreadsheet with everybody and make sure it's right, blah, 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 blah.
And that'll take 10 weeks.
That sounds exhausting. And that sounds like it's going to take a lot of time. But what if you looked at the mechanics of it and implemented those into what you're already doing, right? You're already meeting with people about the thing that you're working on. So why not think about how to use these mechanics from that standpoint, right? Like instead of the next time you run into somebody at the coffee bar or whatever and asking them how their weekend was, why not start asking them these little questions that you've started to try to ask of everyone on your team to try to figure out how they see things differently?
Yeah.
Why not the next time you're in a meeting that has no purpose other than status, maybe ask the question, how do these things relate to each other in terms of which one do we think is more impactful, and start to dig into these questions a little bit more piece by piece, and see what happens. Like,
so what you're positing, I think, and I think I've made this recommendation too, that just asking the question and playing a little bit dumb, maybe, and saying,
and
like,
pick up a marker and be like, oh, maybe we could put a line this way and a line that way, and oh, there's a quadrant diagram in here.
Right, and that's sort of the no explain approach, where you're like, so it sounds like we're talking about a lot of different components here. There's like, these things are all really important, and some of them sound easier to do than others. Like, what if we were to like compare them?
Right.
Yeah. And in a way, like I would compare that framing exactly in the same way to the way you ask a person in an interview, like, you know, hey, I'm a little dumb. Like, I was wondering if you can just like explain this acronym. Like, maybe we could just, I think in a way, just having that mental model of like importance and complexity, or impact and complexity, are two different things that are separate, that can be discussed separately, but are somehow intertwined. Just knowing that you can draw it, but you can also say it. Right.
And I guarantee you that if you go into a meeting like that and you draw a quadrant of impact and complexity, people will find it useful and they will think you are smart. Like that's the secret magic of having the pre-manipulation.
Yes.
The pre-solving of problems.
And the irony is that all you're doing is asking a question. The matrix itself is a question.
Right. Exactly.
Right? It's an open-ended question, just in the way that you're saying, can you tell me what ways this is working and which way this is not.
So I don't think that to your question, like, I don't think that you need to like put together a project plan of how you're going to get this done and put time on the calendar for everybody to do a half-day workshop to get something like this done. Yes. I think it's more about just knowing when to bring out that tool from your toolbox.
Yes. And how it's fun. Yeah, that's the question, is like, when do you know that it's okay to like, now's the time, now they're ready for this?
If you're looking at a list of things, like anytime you're looking at a list of things that's more than, let's say, 4, and you're trying to make that a valuable exercise for people, like people do not like lists of things that are longer than like 4. It's hard to build in your mind how those things relate to one another. I mean, I think that kind of sense making is really a gift that we give to other people. So I feel like give the gift.
It's a
Don't
gift.
be stingy. Don't be stingy with your sense making.
Well, so are those, are there other things? Because we talked about the collaborative IA tool set. What else do you sort of feel is in your back pocket, that when you see something, you're like, oh, this will help people make sense of this particular mess?
So I taught the collaborative IA topic as a webinar. And one of the things that I put in there that I did not expect to get any attention or like praise from attendees was the thing that I have gotten the most comments on in terms of being helpful, which is not about collaborating with other people necessarily, but about what do you do with all of the data that's generated from those collaborations. So one thing that I see happen a lot, and this is with user research as much as with stakeholder research, is you get transcripts of the stuff, or you have your notes in your notebook, and that's what you have. And you go through and you sort of like look through. So one thing that I've proposed as a more useful way of dealing with these things is putting that into a spreadsheet format so that you can compare people's responses. And that means using your script to set up the rows and then using the people's names to set up the columns. And then I also tend to color code their responses by who they are in the organization. So like if I'm interviewing a bunch of people from engineering and a bunch of people from marketing and a bunch of people from product design, I'll have colors for each of those teams so that when I put them next to each other, I can see what the difference response is based on where they are in the organization.
Yes.
For a particular question. And I just find that level of organizing the materials for yourself just reveals patterns from the collaboration. So it kind of like, it's my way of not leaving it all in the notebook, because that happens a lot.
Totally.
I think people just like take tons of notes, and then really what they end up with is whatever's in their head.
Oh,
and
totally.
Whatever ends up in our head is usually, through the filter of whatever we're thinking about or caring about. So
yes, I don't know what the question is, but the answer is always spreadsheets. Like literally, the answer is always spreadsheets. I think
because spreadsheets.
Because spreadsheets. I don't know. It doesn't matter what line of work you are in, but trying to make a spreadsheet of it always helps.
Oh my gosh! If there was one life skill that I could teach to the world, it would be making good spreadsheets. Because I don't know how much experience you have with bad spreadsheets, but
yes,
bad spreadsheets are not helpful.
It's just basically a Word doc.
Yeah, it's a Word document that somebody
pasted some stuff into Excel
across cells.
Wait, the green thing and the blue thing are different?
They're different.
They're different.
They're different.
Oh man, that's hilarious. I have a card here, and I just have to go through my questions, so I apologize.
Just go through your script. It's cool.
I captured something that you had about information anxiety that maybe we talked about a year ago. Positions, convictions, doubt, color, questions. This is
yes,
Richard Saul Werman's How to Frame a Great Conversation frame, I guess.
Did you
make that for him?
It's mine.
It's yours.
I don't think it has anything to do with Richard Saul Werman.
Sorry, he was in my notes somewhere.
I think
nearby this.
I think I know what it is. In a deck that I made for Parsons, probably about 5 years ago, called How to Have a Conversation with a Stranger, I took a bunch of principles from Richard Saul Werman that were things like listen more than you speak, don't finish other people's sentences, don't fill silence needlessly, don't tell me what I think, don't think about what you're going to say, listen to what I am saying.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, exactly.
So these are things I struggle with all the time. So
right,
this is information anxiety?
That is an information
not talking
anxiety,
over somebody,
yes.
Is that something else I'm not supposed to do?
Yes. Don't step on my words.
It was just too fun to do. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. So anyways, the very last slide on that presentation that I did for Parsons that had all of his principles was I shared with them the framework that I use in conversations that I have specifically with stakeholders and users. So I tend to organize my questions into chunks where I establish their position, I understand their convictions, then I get into their doubts, and then I leave room for color and questions. So
she was not looking at the card when she did that, by the way. I mean, maybe no. I think you
I don't think I can read your handwriting.
That's what I'm saying. You know that. I love that.
Yeah.
Even though this was 5 years ago, you still.
Well, I use this all the time. It's just I know where you got the connection with Richard Saul Werman is from 5 years ago.
Gotcha.
No, this I use all the time. So what that means is that you understand that when you go into a conversation, it is inappropriate for you to start talking about doubts the first thing out of your mouth with somebody. Like, it makes a lot more sense to establish their position in the working sense that you have with the problem space before you start to ask them things about what they doubt about the problem that you're working on, or the things that are keeping them up at night, or like the tougher kind of questions that are in that sort of sensitive space. So I tend to use this as a structure to warm people up through. And I don't tell them that I'm doing it. I don't say like, oh, I'm going to ask you about your position. But it just tends to be the way that I organize a script.
And do you take your own notes? Do you record? Do you transcribe? Like, what do you actually do when you're doing
record. I record. And I recommend recording. I think it's really the only way. I also take notes, but I will say that taking notes is a purely theatrical endeavor. I take notes because I want people to believe that I'm listening to them and that I'm getting value out of the conversation. So the notes that I take don't matter in terms of what I do next. the notes that I take are letting the person know that I'm taking something out of the conversation. But in reality, I am listening to that conversation again and typing notes into a spreadsheet.
You type your own notes.
Yes. I don't understand people that don't do it that way.
That just seems like in most of the contexts that I've taught design thinking, when people are doing sort of guerrilla design thinking and doing interviews like of 20, 30 minutes or things like that, I just assume that they don't have time to do that kind of extra work. And I say just bring another person to take the notes.
It's not possible. I've tried it that way. The reason is because the taking of the notes, the first time you have the conversation, you are in the mode of progressing the conversation. But re-listening to the conversation is when you actually hear the real meat of what's going on.
Totally.
Like, you're picking up enough from the conversation to get to the next question and to like kind of build on what they've already told you, but you're not able to see the real story until it's over. Like I truly believe that. And having somebody else take notes for you, I've just never had any luck with that. I need that separate time to listen to it again to get it to be something that I remember actually happening.
I totally understand. In my design thinking context, what I love is when you have the person taking notes and what you can do halfway through is say, was there something you wanted to follow up on? Because they are having that second level conversation.
Having a third person in the room, to me, is like not worth that efficiency at all. Like having a third person in the room completely changes the entire conversation.
Yeah.
Well, like, especially if that person is just there to take notes, all of a sudden you have like this like scribe in the room and people are very aware that they're being like court reported.
Yeah.
Versus like a tape recorder doesn't have the same. I also don't use microphones. Like,
no, obviously. This thing
like that
can record without a microphone. Obviously.
I tend to use, so I just have like a little MP3 recorder and it's very low, shitty quality. It's not like podcasting.
It's very interesting. Like honestly, I don't do a lot of this in my work anymore. So I don't know. I'm curious in a way what other people do. I feel like some people, I was just in Donna Lichtau's workshop at IXD 17. And there was a woman who had one of those smart pens that records audio.
It was pretty cool.
And your notes, and so you can actually go back to whatever you wrote. And she's
live
like,
scribe.
Yeah, and she was like, "This is the best thing I've ever bought." Like in terms of value to money, spent because of a lot of the interviewing. That
I had a live scribe pen a couple years ago for exactly that purpose.
But you don't use it anymore.
No, I don't. I don't know if it's. Maybe I'm getting like cranky because I'm old or something. I don't know. Like there's something about like doing it all manual that like makes me really happy. I don't know how to do it any other way.
You're taking an information bath and you like to enjoy.
Yes, I like to take a leisurely information bath.
Yeah, and you really like to like wallow in the information.
But the way that I actually go about my interviews and the recording of notes afterwards is I tend to try to not have my interviews be back to back. And if I can, I put them with padding in between so that I can do the interview and then immediately sit down and type my notes. Like that's the best cadence for me.
I understand. And one of the joys of having...
And it doesn't take the full length of an interview recording to take the notes of the interview that you just had.
Well, because you're not doing a transcription. I'm doing
notes. I'm not doing a transcription.
You're pulling nuggets.
Yeah, and you have to understand that like in a 30-minute meeting, especially one that you've never met a person before that you're talking to, like at least the first like 4 or 5 minutes is going to be fluff.
Sure.
And the end is
that
also
fluff is very important.
It is important for the people part, but it's not important for the note taking part.
No, fair.
And then same thing with the end. Like there's usually like a couple minutes right before the thing wraps up where you're just like, they're like, oh, so who are you meeting with next? Like, da, 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 da.
Have you tried such and such restaurant?
Yeah, and you just went through this conversation, so you know whether or not there's like a nugget in the end there.
Yes.
That's going to be worth listening to the whole thing for.
Plus it's rolling.
And you can also speed up the recording. So you can listen to it at like 1.5 times.
Yes.
And you can skip over yourself, which also helps, like with the 15-second skip button.
This is fascinating. I don't think I'm going to change how I teach interviewing in my design thinking workshops because it's fun. But I think it's good to tell. This is actually really helpful information for me to say, like, this is how a pro does it. maybe you can do it this way. If
Everybody's got their own way.
Yeah, no, totally. It's fascinating. It's really good to know. Can we talk about time a little bit?
Sure. I like time.
I know. I mean, you've done a lot of work on time.
I hate time. I like time. I hate time. I like time. I have like a multiple personality about time.
Well, I think we're talking about the purpose of these conversations for me is to understand more about conversation design, but I think conversations happen over time.
Yes.
And one of the things that I find interesting about changing culture, changing and creating change inside of organizations is that things happen at the speed of human relationships. So I think there's this interesting component of time where the work can't go faster than it can go.
Right.
And I don't know what that rate is in your mind, but there is a human pace to certain things.
Yeah, there's some realities about time that are tricky when it comes to work. One of them is that you can't work faster than what the environment will allow. But the other is sort of the opposite of that, which I think is actually more interesting, which is work will expand to fill the time allotted. Right?
Yes.
Like if you give yourself a week to do something versus giving yourself a month to do something, I don't know that the product of the month is going to be better than the product of a week or the day.
Yes.
And so more time doesn't actually mean more quality in all cases.
Yes.
But there's times when I think the impact of time degrades our work unnecessarily. Like a good example is the conversation we just had about interview notes. Like I do hear a lot of people shipping their recordings off to transcription services so that they can have a record of the conversation having happened. And I don't know that that's useful for them to have saved that time to not do it themselves, to now have it in a Word document that they're never actually going to consume because it's not a useful output for the thing that they've now saved the time to create.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
No, it does. It absolutely does. Work is, I usually describe it as working is a gas, because in Boyle's law, a gas at standard pressure and temperature expands to fill the space available to it.
Work is just some hot air.
Well, I mean, if work was a fluid, it would fill the container.
Right.
Which it doesn't.
Right.
Right. If this was a thin glass or a thick or flat glass,
right.
It fills the glass. But what it actually does is it fills the whole glass.
Yeah.
And the entire room. And do you use
work? It's a gas.
Work is a gas. It's a gas in the bad way. It's like a fart.
Like a fart in a glass.
It's like a fart in a glass. The fart doesn't stay in the glass. The fart goes everywhere. So how do you compartmentalize and determine the right amount of time to spend on something based on what is good enough? How do you determine what's good enough? And then allot that time.
So once again, spreadsheets.
Whoa.
Yeah. I am a big fan of estimation, even when I am not asked to estimate. And I do estimation as a game with myself to see if I can get within a certain error rate of how long I think things will take me to do. So I have a spreadsheet that I break down all the things that I think I need to do for a project, including interviewing people and taking my own notes and color coding said notes and running workshops and all the pieces of the particular project. And I make an estimation. And then along with that estimation, so it's, each row is a task. And then the next column is the number of hours total that thing's going to take me. And then the next set of columns is days mapped to the actual days that are available to work on the project. So let's say that I'm working on a project that is part of a 9-to-5 reality, as I currently am, then it's going to have Monday through Friday. But, I have that day where I'm going to be at a conference, and so I'm not going to be at work.
Mini calendar in the spreadsheet.
Yes.
Whoa.
And then I map the number of hours into each of those days. So I say, okay, so this thing's going to take me 6 hours total. I need to find 6 hours somewhere in this span. And I also have the dependency of the other things are waiting on that thing.
Yes.
So
I might ask you for a scrubbed version of one of these. This is amazing.
Sure. I'll show you one.
Spreading good Excel wherever we go.
I love Excel, but I don't use Excel. I use Google Documents.
Sure. Well, then it's everywhere. I have a spreadsheet that tracks how many workshops I run for who, and whether it was a full day or a half day, or was it a multiple day? So I can actually understand how much, was it remote? Was it not remote? Like, I want to be able to track those things. But that is like, I'm a calendar thinker. So I always put something in my calendar.
Well, the calendar comes after the spreadsheet for me.
Well, the spreadsheet is a mini calendar, though.
Well, but I don't use the spreadsheet as a calendar. I use the spreadsheet to figure out how I need to allocate time on my calendar.
Yeah.
So that way I can say, okay, so I need to have these 3 meetings with stakeholders on this day, and then in between them, I need to have my time to take notes. So I'm going to put that on my calendar right now and find the time with those people and find the time to take the notes.
Yes.
I need to run that workshop, which means I'm going to need this many hours in the days preceding it to create all of the materials and the agenda and everything else. I'm going to need to have a check-in with that person to approve said materials and agenda and everything else. So I have to put all that into the schedule from a time perspective, but then I also have to put it onto my calendar so that I actually do it.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Yeah.
If it's on your calendar, you have to do it.
Right.
What else about time? Because I know you've done a lot of thinking about this in relation to any of these things that we've been talking about.
Well, I think that I think there's a correlation between not necessarily planning your life, but recording your life. Like, I think planning is different than recording. Like, knowing what I did yesterday to me is maybe more powerful than knowing what I'll do tomorrow. In terms of happiness. Like I'm
sorry, you're saying that knowing what you're going to do today
versus what I did yesterday.
What you did yesterday.
Yeah, is more powerful than knowing what I'm going to do tomorrow.
Tell me more about that. How so?
Because I think, this relates to happiness. This is not about efficiency. Like, fuck efficiency. I really don't care about that at this point.
I think nature isn't efficient, so why should we be? So
there you go. But no, I think that like we let time fly by and we don't take notice of things that we're doing that are either good or bad for us. Like, for example, if I don't pay attention to what I did yesterday, I don't know the things that I did yesterday that I maybe shouldn't do today. Or I don't know the things that I should do today because they made me really happy yesterday.
Yes.
So I get a lot of joy in recording my life as it happened. I also spend a lot of time planning, but a lot of that has to do with the intersections that other people and timelines for projects. So I don't know that that's really about happiness for me. The part that's really, I think, increasing joy is the paying attention to what the hell you do with your time.
I think that's wonderful. And now do you still do the visual calendar where you draw a little box a day?
Yes.
And so you have how many of these now?
This is I started it in 2012. So this is my 5th year. Yeah.
And so you draw a little thing at the end of each day?
It's not, I don't generally do it on the day. It's usually the next day. Sometimes days will stack up and I'll have to do like 2 or 3 at a time,
you spend
especially
time on
if
the road.
Travel.
Yes.
But yeah, it's generally after the fact.
And what do you do with that artifact at the end of the year? Or at the end of the month? Like, are you...
Nothing. I look at it. It's on the wall in my house. James actually had to put one on the ceiling recently because we ran out of wall space in the little cove that I have them.
We have to make like a little like a poster, like a flipping stack for you.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. There's something I really like. I really like looking at them. I really like just kind of stepping back and saying like, this is my life. I mean, my entire life is on those sheets of paper. Like everything that I did, all of the important moments, like people being born, people dying, my wedding day, like people that I love doing crazy things with their creativity, like all of it is right there. And I can see when it happened and I can see it in relationship to other things. Like, oh, wasn't it crazy that thing happened? And then like I flew home and flew to Japan the next day. Like, you know, all those things that I don't think that I would know about my life if I didn't have it right there.
Well, and it makes perfect sense to me that you and the work you do would do things like this. Like, you love to physicalize information and step away from it. You use a wall as one of your primary tools in your work.
Yeah.
Right? Being able to put something up and step away from it means that you can have the impact kind of wash over you. It's like the complexity importance diagram.
Mhm.
You step in and you do it, but then you step back and you can let it.
And then you can see it.
You can see it all wash over
Yeah.
you. I keep I write 3 things that I'm grateful for most nights. Because I used to, when I was a kid, I would keep a journal, and I found I was just very mopey in my journal. And you're like,
I also keep journals.
Yeah.
I do them in the morning though, not at night.
Yeah. So, and I do morning pages in the morning. So I actually did a thing in my therapy years ago where I went through like a year of my gratitude journal. And I just turned them into Post-it notes, and I did a clustering. I did an affinity clustering
That's
of
cute.
it.
I like
And
it.
I got to like understand what's making, what makes Daniel happy, which was really, it was like food and, Miles and Carl and Pete and Rob, featured very largely, and bicycles, and I was like, oh, the beach, bicycles, my friends, and
my
food.
God. Daniel
There it
loves
is.
the beach.
Everyone always wants to
I've never
leave
met
the
anyone
beach.
that loves the beach as much as you.
So one of the things that's great about being with Janet is that she was willing to stay at the beach that extra, until the next ferry.
Oh my goodness.
Whereas everyone else, when we get at the beach house for the summer, they're like, so it's 3
Okay,
o'clock.
it's
We've
3
been here
o'clock.
for
It's nap time.
It's nap time. And I'm like,
Naparita time.
and I'm like, maybe we can stay at the beach longer. To his credit, Toby stuck around as well. Played a little bit of beach bocce.
Wow, Janet, you really passed the test.
She did. So I also want to talk about your book.
Okay.
Because you've done something really interesting with it. First, I want to make a little bit about the process that went into it. But what you've done, which I think is so interesting, is you've taken your thoughts and you turned them into a product. Mm-hmm. So if I love you, I can have you with me, your brain with me all the time. My mother can read it and be bathed in your way of thinking. But then you took the book and you turned it, you made it ephemeral again. Mm-hmm. You turned it into a digital platform where anybody can look at it.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting about that, I'm sort of, when I think about conversation design, right, I think that a product is a conversation, right? But it's a very limited conversation. I go hear you speak, and then I can buy your book, and I can hang out with you, and then I can tweet to you, right? Mm-hmm. That's the limited conversation. But now, I can go onto your website and there's stuff that's there. I can just hyperlink to all the words and just swim in the book.
Yeah. And
it's really interesting that you've chosen to decommodify your book that way.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I mean, if you ask me, why did you write a book about information architecture? Specifically, why did you write a book about information architecture for everybody as opposed to for a heavily academic audience that practices user experience design?
Yeah, this is not an O'Reilly book with with 2 birds on it.
Right. I do not have an animal on the cover of my book. Just Helvetica.
Yeah, it's just Helvetica.
So the reason is because I think that, and this is, it maybe sounds kind of Susie cream cheese, but I just think the world needs to be a clearer place. And in order for the world to get to be a clearer place, you need more people who are armed with sense-making skills. And so the idea, and I remember the day that James and I made the decision that we were going to develop the book for free on the web. And it was a very frank conversation in which we both were like, yeah, we've made what we wanted to make off of this endeavor from a commercial standpoint, and people are getting a lot out of it. But we know that there's people out there that are not getting anything out of it because they're not able to buy a $25 book.
Sure.
Right? So how are we going to get that to those people? And the best way was to put it online for free.
Yes.
And I've never been happier than when people come up to me and tell me that they read the book online. I just think that that's wonderful. And I would also say I am surprised. Well, one, I was surprised that sales actually went up, not down, as a result of publishing online. 2, I'm surprised how many people actually end up buying books from me anyways, specifically in person. The new journey of my user, I guess, is often that somebody will have found out about my work online, will have read a decent portion of the book online, heard that I'm going to give a talk in their local community or at a conference they're going to go to that thing, meet me in person, and then buy a book out of my backpack. That's like the more
yes, that's a great journey,
and that's a great journey. Like that to me is a more rewarding journey.
And I think in terms of thinking about the conversation that people are having with your work, this dialogue, by putting it on the internet, you've expanded the amount of dialogue that can happen in and around the work.
Yeah, because if they're reading the book and their coworker is like, oh, what's that book that you're reading? They don't need to tell them to go buy a $25 book. They can just tell them, hey, the whole thing is online.
Yes.
And then they can be reading the same content and talking about it as it relates to their project. And I find that to be valuable too.
I think it's a very, I don't know if you're a millennial or not, but it seems like a very...
I am technically a millennial.
It seems like a very generous, sharey thing that like somebody who's not quite a millennial like me would be like, oh, why don't you just have like an ebook that, I mean, you also can buy an ebook version of this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But it's like, oh, pay what you wish ebook and buy the thing for whatever. It's like, meanwhile, the whole thing is for free. Like that's a really open-hearted thing to do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I also, like, just for the nerd part of it, I had so much fun. So Lauren Davey helped me to build the engine, which the book is actually hosted on. And the engine that he provided allowed us to play with the information architecture of the book. So you mentioned being able to sort of swim in the book.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that I really wanted to enable, was that it wouldn't just be something that was read in like a flow from beginning to end, that it was something that you could actually navigate through language. And so in the online version, all of the key terms are highlighted and you can click on them, and then you can get to a page that defines the term, but then also tells you all the related terms and then all the places in the book that term appears. So you can sort of read it out of order. But because the book is also constructed of these one-page essays, you're still reading it in an order. You're just not reading it in my prescribed order. So it was really like, it was a fun act of information architecture to sort of like fuck with the way that the book is read.
I know, I understand. So, you've deconstructed it. And what you've done is...
And you couldn't do that with an ebook. Like, that's...
I don't think... Well, actually, it's interesting. Like, I've seen other book visualizations that they mean less. They're more about, like, chapter size or word count or, which character is around and which color. Like, there's lots of ways to visualize a book, but yours has significance because it's an information architecture book. And it allows somebody to, like, experience information architecture in real time. Yeah, I find you deconstructed, you deproductized it in a way of making the conversation somebody can have with it much, much bigger, much broader, which is really, really awesome. I think that's super cool.
Thank you.
And it's been translated into Spanish and Japanese, is that right?
Yes.
And whatever language, you just need somebody to step forward and say, I will translate this, and then it'll...
Yeah, no, we have a list. We have a list of people who have stepped forward.
Is it a Google spreadsheet?
It might be.
It might be a spreadsheet.
It might be a spreadsheet. Yeah, we have several translators that are interested in other languages. And so this Japanese one was, I worked with a publisher, and they did the bulk of the work in terms of getting the translation and doing all the diagrams and also doing all of the graphic design and the layout design.
Did the diagrams have to get redone in a different language?
They didn't actually, which was surprising.
These some of the like the
worksheets and things. They did need to be translated, and somebody needs to go in and do all of the manipulation of the art to fit labels that are longer or shorter than than the English and stuff. But then for Spanish, I actually was really thrilled that a woman from the UX community in Mexico reached out to me to work on it as a project independently. So we actually self-published the Spanish edition. And so that was really fun because I did all the graphic design and the indexing myself, even though it's in a language that I do not understand.
Do you feel like you understand Spanish better now?
No. I mean, not really. No, I don't think I picked much of it up.
Because I remember years ago when Design Gym was prototyping in Chile, building a community there, like I got somebody to explain to me like the names of the 5 phases of design thinking, and I found it really enjoyable to be able to talk about like explorar and
no, I guess I picked up that kind of that level, but I don't feel like I can like speak Spanish any better or maybe I speak it worse.
Yeah, maybe worse.
Yeah, I mean, I can't actually pronounce several of the words in the title of the book, so
that's amazing. And it's just how to make sense of any mess.
Yeah,
that's where we can find it.
That is.
We're at the time of the night where I ask you: is there anything that I have not asked you that I should have asked you? Is there anything else that we should know?
I mean, I will take this as an opportunity to plug things that I care about.
Plug away.
Well, first of all, if anybody is interested in information architecture, I highly recommend that you become a member of the Information Architecture Institute. It is a professional organization of people who are trying to figure out how to make the world a clearer place. And I think that that's worth putting your dollars towards in the sort of vote with your wallet domain. I also would love for further participation from new people around World Information Architecture Day, which just happened this February 18th. So we're a couple days after that now, but we are already planning our 2018 event. So we had 58 locations in 28 countries, in 5 continents, 10 languages. It was pretty great, but we just want to grow that even bigger. So
that's amazing.
If anybody's listening that has a town that they think information architecture education should come to, and they want to be the local leader that brings it there, we have the toolkits and the resources to help you to do that. So.
Yeah, because we're not going to have less information.
No.
And entropy will mean that it will become less architected over time.
Yes.
It's a growth industry.
It is a growth industry.
That's good. Well, thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Dan.
I really, really appreciate your time. These topics, I think, are important topics that I grapple with. I think you burn the straw things of them as well. and I hope that, by the way, one of the things that's really enjoyable, I'm actually trying to have some of these transcribed. And the guy who's transcribing them for me was like, this is really interesting stuff. So when the guy transcribing them is getting into it,
it's a good sign.
It's a good sign.
It's a good sign.
And so I enjoy that. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. I certainly enjoy spending time with you.
I did. Now let's get some dinner.
Let's get some dinner.
Okay.
And scene. And we're going to leave it right there. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please check out my other episodes at theconversationfactory.com/podcast. If you want to join the conversation, don't forget to check out theconversationfactory.com/coaching to sign up for 30 minutes of free coaching that I might use on a future episode. That's theconversationfactory.com/coaching. Thanks so much for your fine attention, and I'll see you next time.